Hello and welcome to the Real Zero podcast with me, Daniel Grant.
And me, Hugh Montgomery.
Hugh, how's this week gone? I know well, when we recorded this episode, it's Trump's 100 days. I presume when people listen to it, it might be more like his 150 or 200 days. So what's your feeling of his first 100 and where do you think the next 100 is going to
go? Frightening and more frightening, probably. And we've seen the dismantling of climate policy in America, its leadership globally. If there was leadership, it's certainly gone now. Pretty much anyone in the health sector involved in climate's been sacked. John Balbus has gone. The funding for the research has gone. The data sets, we're worried that even access to the data sets is going to disappear. And then we've got elections today in Great Britain for the councils, where we've got some parties who are also playing the same songs about why should we decarbonise. So worrying times politically, but we can talk about that a bit more with our guest this morning.
We can, indeed. And well, the guest might have a bit of insight into some other things. I would say probably the things that I think which are quite positive off the back of it is because of how Trump has been acting, massive swing in Canada to get in.
Yeah,
a Liberal leader
got in.
And at the time of recording, we might eat our words on this one, but the Australian election's coming up. And there's been a bit of a swing going on there as well for the same reason. So we'll see what happens.
All right. Well, thank you for counterbalancing log.
Anyway, I'll let you introduce our guest today because you might have met him last night and suffering the effects.
I did. So yes, I'm going to let George introduce himself. So our guest today is George Polk. And we were reminiscing just now. So George, back in the day, was about the only person in Great Britain who was also thinking about climate change way back. At least must be 25 years ago now, George?
25 years ago now, yeah.
So anyway, tell us who you are and what you've been up to in the climate space in 25 years and how you got there.
Well, I like most, I'm an avid follower of you in every possible way. I came to climate, so I used to be a technology entrepreneur. I was in the mobile phone industry, and I watched that transition happen. My first phone was the size of a suitcase that we carried around, but when I built my first network, phones were analog, and then eventually they became digital, and obviously now we have iPhones and everything else. And the whole idea that mobility and data and so forth were going to transform society was something that had been part of what I was working on in the early days. But I got to a point now about 25 years ago where I felt I'd sort of done my bit for that. And I was reading a book actually about climate change by James Lovelock, and which suggests at the end that we're all going to live short, nasty, brutish lives at the poles if we don't do something about it. And there won't be very many of us left. And so I decided at that point that I'd try to do something about climate change. And for the first 10, 12 years, I worked philanthropically, bringing together donors and advocates and things like that to create collaborations around climate change. And then for the last 10 years, have been investing in businesses that are related to climate change around the world. So trying to sort of push action forward in various different ways.
Right. So, I mean, when we first met, it was Catalyst Project, and you had Jim Hansen from the States, and indeed there was rough other things, Rocky Mountain Institute, which we might talk about a little later on. But we will start with the first question. So now we know who you are. Anyone listening to this podcast knows the answer. And I think you've sort of already hinted at it when you're talking about short, brutish lives at the poles. If we don't act on climate change, if we, the people listening to this podcast, don't take this seriously and act right now, and others don't, how long before civilization starts collapsing, or as we know it, has imploded, do you think?
Well, I think so. I think it's an incredibly complicated question to answer, mainly because humans are survivors. And so humans find ways to survive in the little crevices of the world, kind of no matter what happens. And so one of the things that's remarkable is if you look at places that are already devastated by climate change, and you look at the people who are there, you have death and devastation and disease and everything else, and yet there are still lots of humans there. And so from a social perspective or society perspective, I'm in the camp of you already see things coming apart. I mean, we're not Syrian. If we lived in Syria, we'd feel that our country had been ripped apart by climate change. Wow. And where we are, it may take a little bit longer, but our societies are all under stress right now. So I would say starting now over the next decade, but it may persist much longer in certain corners of the world.
Yeah, I suspect you may be right. I mean, if we're heading for well, we're heading north of 4.2 degrees at the moment, which will get us to a permanent level mass extinction. So that probably is the end of the species. But the civilization, as you say, there are likely to be people, just not as in a civilization. No, I mean, we had data yesterday, you probably saw in India punching way through 50 degrees. And you can't survive in temperatures of 50 degrees without living inside air-conditioned domes, which isn't really, and you can't grow your crops either. So, all right, so that's, we're in danger is the bit. Why, we've known this, you've done this for 25 years. How the hell do we get to a situation where emissions are still going up, policies still aren't enacted? How do we get to the situation where after 25 years this isn't solved? Because technology, I imagine you would agree, is there.
Yeah, look, I think the way I look at it is we're in what I would call the fifth phase of engagement around the problem. And the first phase, which is where you and I got started, was we believed that people didn't understand there was a problem. There was a lack of knowledge. There was a lack of, and that was my camp, right? So when I read James Lovelock's book, I got to the end of the book and I thought, oh, you know, I knew him as a scientist. I respected him, but I thought this surely must be an exaggeration.
Right.
And I then went to see James Hansen and John Schellenhuber, both of whom then with a whiteboard mapped out quite a complex picture of how this was in fact a big problem. So I and you and others, you wrote a book for children. I put together a couple of events to bring together a couple thousand people who were all influential and so forth to express that we have a problem, thinking that everyone would leave that room thinking, oh my gosh, we have a problem. I now need to do something about it. The excuse, I think people would say, is that people said, oh, this is a vague problem and we don't really see what we're supposed to do. So that took us to the second phase of engagement, which was around saying, we can do something about it. That's where, you know, Nick Stern was the poster child of that. There's a response here. It's not going to be too expensive. We can solve the problem and so forth. And that was supposed to galvanize people who were otherwise inactive because they were confused, right?
Right.
That resulted in some action and some government frameworks and things like that. But they were all kind of general statements of ambition rather than anything terribly specific. And then the third phase, which is what in many ways you're still engaged in, was to say, okay, let's go from the general, we could do something about this, to the very specific, well, there is a pathway here. There's a pathway to change the energy system. There's a pathway to change the transportation system. Energy efficiency takes you to all these things. Let's articulate that so that people believe it's true, and therefore then they will do something about it. And we all spent lots of effort and energy articulating this in great detail. And I mean, you know, if you compare where we were now to where we were 20 years ago, people have done some things about it. They just haven't done enough about it. And so then you look at phase 4, we all looked at it and said, well, okay, there's some pathway, there's a little bit of momentum. Now we're about how do we accelerate that? And so we all shouted from the rooftops, here's what's actually happening today. Here's disaster X, or here is intervention Y, or whatever, and tried to make clear the consequences of not acting, thinking that would lead to acceleration. And unfortunately, we're now in the 5th phase, which is arguably, outside of China and a few other places, deceleration.
Right.
Because now people are like, oh, well, that would require me to do something different. And the inertia in the system is so strong that, you know, Trump and a number of other governments are beginning to illustrate that people kind of like living this imagined past and don't really want to take the effort to build the potential future. And so you're left in this inertia state where that takes you to 4 degrees.
So how do we fix that? Because you and I have lived through the story. Firstly, you can't say scary things to people because if you scare them, they run away. So we lived through 20 years of saying, hey, the world could be a nicer place if you move, which if you're poor, you just go, I don't care, I need food on the table. And if you're wealthy, you go, can't get much nicer than my skiing holiday and my kids going to an independent school. We've now got to the bit where it is mighty scary, but we're still being told you can't scare people. How do we navigate that? I mean, you know me, I'm very firm in the camp because I'm a doctor of telling people the truth and then helping them understand what they need to do to solve the problem. But what do we do? Have we failed to get the message to people, or have we failed to get the message in the right way to the right people?
I mean, I've never been as firmly in the camp that you can't scare people. I think connecting immediate bad things to this is something that actually can be effective.
Hmm.
But if you look at where progress has been most successful, it is China.
Right.
And in the end, that happened because you had a fairly rational government make a fairly rational set of policies because they felt clearing present danger. I mean, hundreds of millions of people in China live in coastal cities that will be inundated,
Right.
and the natural disasters will be horrible, and the government could kind of understand that. And they took years to understand it. I mean, we all
Yeah.
worked with them to take them through a pathway where they could understand the health risks and so forth.
Hmm.
Then they got it, and then they've been acting on it since. How we get Western governments to act rationally is the biggest challenge.
Well, I suppose being fair to a Western government, if they got the short-term cycle, it's hard to convince them to look beyond the short-term cycle. But what about business? Because you could say the Chinese government is paid like a business. They just got a 30 years time frame and have gone, okay, we need to look. How is it that you've still got fossil fuel companies run by intelligent, well-informed people who will still try to extract more fossil fuel and burn more fossil fuel? And we've still got investors who will invest heavily in that happening, even though they must know what the outcomes will be. How does that happen, and how do we change their minds? What's going on in the mind of a CEO of a big fossil fuel company?
Well, you called out two audiences. You called out the CEOs, and then you called out the investors.
Yes.
The CEOs arguably have lots of excuses for what they do because that is what they're paid to do. I mean, they also live in a short-term cycle. They also have shareholders. BP is, of course, a great example, right? I mean, BP tried to make a shift. You can argue they did it well or badly, but they tried to make a shift. And activist investors engaged to try to push them back into being wholly in the oil business.
But it must have, but these people are like you. I mean, you've got 2 children. I've got a son. Surely the short-term share return and dividend in a 3-year cycle of cashing in your options and so forth must get trumped, no pun intended, by the fact you've got kids.
I mean, no, because the salary that you're receiving is what allows you to buy the house in Spain that you take your kids to for the school holidays. I mean, they don't perceive themselves as having this same long-term luxury, they would say, to plot those changes for their companies. Because if you're the CEO of BP and you come forward with this agenda and all of a sudden you're not drilling for oil as much, you lose your job.
So does that mean that we have failed to articulate the clear and present danger to human civilization and as we know it? Because you were talking earlier on, 18% of the world's surface area very soon that's occupied by humans will be uninhabitable because of they will have temperatures above the Sahara. It'll be desertified. And we know, if you look at the reports coming out of the security reports from last year, they're talking about a 3 Celsius temperature rise, which we're now heading way beyond, producing 4 billion dead or migrating. They must read those reports,
but they don't believe them, right? And that's the problem. I mean, when you go out into the everyday world, people believe that life is going to continue more or less the same as it is today. People, I think neurologically, you would know more about this than me, right? But neurologically, we have a very hard time projecting ourselves into a distant future that is different. And by distant, it doesn't have to be that far away, but it's conceptually far away from where you live today. And people generally believe that it's all going to be the same tomorrow as it was yesterday. And it's not only around climate change. I mean, the fascinating thing, you talk about investors and CEOs and so forth, people don't understand the speed at which technology will change their industry or in which competition from China is going to change their environment or whatever. I mean, IBM sits there and waits for, their networked PDP-11 to work or whatever it was, right? I mean, generally speaking, we're really bad at anticipating extreme changes to where we are. Yeah. And so, yes, we've done a bad job of getting people to believe that.
And you are right. I mean, it's something, I don't know, Dan, whether we talked about this before, but, Dan is also a doctor. And if you look at the health education bit, when we go back, it's why governments don't run health education campaigns.
Yeah.
They do a little bit every now and again because they need to be seen to do something. But the reason they don't is they don't work. You can tell people that taking ecstasy on a Saturday isn't a smart idea, but it's great fun at the time you take it, and it's associated with some nebulous indeterminate risk, unwanted pregnancies, unprotected sector right now is great fun, hard to connect it with what might come downstream. Same with drugs, same with cigarettes, same with alcohol. So this is the same, right?
It's the same, but it's also what we talked about the other week about, we actually had a quick chat about literacy rates and education right at the beginning. And then people aren't really, they don't have the educational skills to understand science communication, let alone read in a greater way than a 10-year-old. Then it's going to be really hard to communicate in a way which you can.
Well, that's a really good point, actually, that I might put back to George, because now you raise it, is this partly an issue of literacy? So if we look at COVID that I was heavily involved in, we had politicians in a cabinet, and they'd been selected because they would vote to back a prime minister on Brexit. And the level of scientific illiteracy, these were people without science degrees, generally couldn't understand maths, certainly didn't understand sociology or human behavior. And being charitable, you could therefore forgive them for not knowing how to manage a pandemic, because they just didn't have the education to be able to even know how to learn about those things. Is that part of our problem? Is it that being charitable to a CEO or a politician, that they can't be expected to understand climate physics or agroeconomics or check binary weather state changes? Or is that, am I being too charitable?
No, I think you're being, for many of them, you're being too charitable. But I think the issue is that in general, in our society, we've decided to become suspicious of expertise. Everybody now, you go to the doctor gives you a diagnosis, and you go you Google it, and then Google told you that the doctor's wrong, and Google surely knows better, and off you go. And ChatGPT is, of course, a manifestation of this even further, right? And ChatGPT is known to try to find answers for you, whether they're right or wrong, just to supply you an answer.
Yeah.
But that's very satisfying to people. That's what they want. They want an answer. They don't even care so much whether it's right or wrong. So I think that the hard piece now is that we no longer, you and I would say, you follow the data to the conclusions, you consult the experts, and then maybe you have some qualification around whether you believe them or not or whatever. That trend is not the trend that is in the West. Now, by the way, in Asia, it's very different. I mean, in Asia, there is a tremendous Singapore is a great example, but lots of other places, there is an urge to defer to the experts, and there's an urge to defer to the data. But the Trump people understand their community in America, and so one of the first things that they're doing is destroying the data, right? Because you get rid of the experts, you take them out of the universities, you shut down the universities, you shut down the convenings that allow people to talk about these things, and then you destroy the data and the means to collect the data and so forth. Then all there's left is mythology, and that's where the place they want to list.
So is this, thinking about this now, what you're describing, I suppose, is distributed trust, isn't it? So we used to go, I don't know, I need to book a holiday, so I'll go to George Polk, travel agent, because he's an expert in travel agency and he knows about travel, and he will find me the place to go in the hotel. And now we go to Trustpilot and TripAdvisor and look. So we're no longer looking for the expert to tell us. We're looking about what everyone else thinks.
Right.
Is that an opportunity as much as a threat? Because if the political and business leadership of the world has not led us to success on climate, is there an opportunity now, as much as a threat, maybe, for we, the people listening to this podcast, you and me, to work together to change the narrative and take action for ourselves? Is there an opportunity as well as a threat here or not?
I think the challenge is that it goes back to the neurology of us thinking ahead, right? Are we actually able to act in our own self-interest in a consistent way? And I think the data generally shows we're often not, right? I mean, we drive too fast, we drink too much, we smoke, we do all these things. We as a society, we need to be regulated, and we get to choose maybe how much or how little regulation, but we don't opt into that easily. We need that to be imposed on us. There's a reason why we have rules and justice systems and things like that. And I think the challenge here is that we've lost the ability to be regulated around these issues effectively. I mean, Europe is interesting in the work I've seen over the last 20 years, if you look at the policy environments that have emerged, many of them are great, actually. I mean, there's a fantastic target in the UK. It's legally binding, et cetera, et cetera. The challenge is what we've failed to do is to build a political consensus around those amongst the voters, right? And the question is, how is it possible to do that? And that goes to your core question, right?
Right.
Can the masses really lead you there? And I mean, so far, the jury isn't very promising.
And is that, again, coming back, if we've targeted, as you and I did over many years, I went for politicians, COP negotiations, trying to get help from the climate negotiating texts, change that narrative, didn't work. We then went after businesses to try to say them that hasn't worked. Is it because we should have focused first on we, the masses? Because presumably we can create the permissive environment for politicians to move into. We can create the market space for businesses to move. Are we the leverage point?
I think we're the issue. I don't know whether we're the leverage point. I think the challenge is, how do we supply support to the people who have expertise, who can then build the frameworks that we all then act within. And we are usually not great at rational self-regulation. I mean, I'll use a silly example. When I was a kid, I went to school in America, and the drinking age kept getting changed just about the time when I would be able to drink. And it would go up from, 18 to 19 to 20 to 21. And it would change state by state in response to some dramatic event where some 14-year-old had gone and gotten drunk and driven and run over somebody and killed them. Well, the 14-year-old was already illegal at the 18-year-old drinking age, so it didn't make any difference anyway.
Yeah.
And of course, this has been happening all along. And then there were 25-year-olds who also got drunk and ran people over. So it was an entirely irrational response to a problem, but people wanted to do something. And I think here you see people wanting to do something in response to a disaster or something. But once that disaster recedes, they're no longer that interested.
Yeah.
And it creates these policy discontinuities that are very hard for us to live within.
Yeah, it's the boiling the frog bit too, isn't it? But Dan, you were...
As I was thinking about the rescue theory that we have, where something happens and there's this knee-jerk reaction to do something to it.
Yeah.
I do wonder, do you think that what needs to happen is something absolutely catastrophic and horrible, but to a population that the people care about, so to the West?
I mean, that will certainly stimulate something, right? I mean, but if you think about, so pick your catastrophic thing. So Manhattan floods. Well, actually, that already happened.
Right, exactly.
A major city has some kind of disaster already happened.
A massive power outage affecting the whole of the Iberian Peninsula this week due to temperature fluctuations in Spain.
Yeah. And so, I mean, you mentioned India, right? I mean, people are they've already been summers where people have large numbers of people who die from the heat. Right? So I think the challenge is that we're a little bit like the frog in the pot. I mean, people have been warning about this, and then when it happens, you go, oh yeah, that was the thing they were talking about. Let's get on with life, right? I mean, again, we're living in relative ignorance. People today in Darfur or Equatorial Africa or lots of other places where disasters are happening today, have been experiencing this for a long time, and they're not necessarily able to either move us or even themselves to do much about it.
Let me, in the last few minutes we've got, let me come back to solutions, George, because you ran the Rocky Mountain Institute, so you know a lot about the technology, and you are a technologist at heart. First thing, do we have the solutions in terms of clean power generation, transmission, energy storage, grid distribution, deployment of new technology like nuclear, for instance? Do we have the technologies available if we had the political and financial will to deploy them? Could we fix the problem?
Yes, and so I'll go from being pessimistic to optimistic.
Okay.
I mean, the optimistic and, in fact, realistic view is that the energy system, the transportation system, ultimately even the manufacturing system, all of these major components of the economy are cheaper and better if you do them in a renewable way. And they are happening massively at scale. It is cheaper today to generate new electricity from renewable sources. It is better. It's a better way to provide an energy system. And then transportation is, off the charts better if you move to electricity and then ultimately to autonomy. And what we're seeing now is the same thing happening in manufacturing. I don't know if you've come across them, but there are these things in China now called dark factories. And they're dark factories not because they're scary. They're dark factories because they don't have any light. They don't turn on lights because they don't have any people. They're just automation. And China's supposed to be the place for low-cost manufacturing because people are cheap. No, China's becoming the place for low-cost manufacturing because the robots are cheap. And all of those things are going to be massively deflationary. I mean, it costs so much less to run an economy on infinitely available renewable energy applied to AI and manufacturing and robotics and all these kinds of things. In the next decade, we're going to see unbelievable shifts that will make life on Earth much more pleasant, much cheaper, much more, prosperity much more available to poor people, all those good things. The challenge is that it's going to create social dislocation because people are going to have less jobs, and you're going to have this transition time when people are losing their jobs, but the things they're getting aren't quite good enough yet, and so those people are going to be confused. And so you then go back to those people being confused. What do? They elect Trump. They elect autocrats who are going to point to this marvelous past that they wish they still had. And so if we can get through that period, I think that's why one of the reasons I have a hard time answering your question about how long do we have.
Right.
If over the next decade we can see that happen at scale,
Right.
we actually can emerge in a much better place.
So we can do this. Where do you sit? Because I've had to shift on this. Where do you shift? I mean, I think we know we're going to have carbon capture and storage, right? Because becoming net zero emitters or zero emitters isn't enough anymore. We need to do that, and we need to start drawing down carbon dioxide. Let's take that as a given. We're going to have to do that. Where are you on the more contentious issue of geoengineering? Because the data in the last few months, Jim Hanson's group have shown that particularly loss of sulfate particles coming from shipping fuel has meant we've lost low cloud over those oceans where the ships went. That's meant that we're reflecting less light back into space, and we have colossally increased global heating as a consequence to that. We've been shielding ourselves with our own pollution to a degree. That sort of makes the case, maybe, you might argue, that putting sulfate particles or equivalent back in, or ice crystals, or some sort of other geoengineering is necessary now. We just have to crack on and do it. Where do you stand on that?
Before you go into that, George, just Hugh, in a nutshell, what is geoengineering?
Oh, okay. So this is, science fiction terraforming. This is you change the atmosphere and the geophysics of the atmosphere in a way to change global energy balance. So the common ones, I was about to say spouted, but that's a bad pun. We're talking about taking salt water and spraying it high into the atmosphere to reflect light back, clouds,
Right.
or seeding clouds with small particles to make things reflect back. So it's that sort of process, which is separate from carbon capture and storage, which is drawing down carbon from the atmosphere. You could do it with a forest, you could do it with algae, you could do it with potentially seeding the oceans with iron compounds to try to capture carbon in that sort of way.
Right.
But this is talking about changing the global energy balance, basically, or sticking mirrors in space. There's another
Simple terms, think of it as mirrors reflecting back heat. Right, yeah.
Gotcha. Right, George, back to you.
I mean, I think it, unfortunately, like all these things, the answer is complicated. Yeah, I think the answer is we are going to need it because we're not going to meet our carbon budget. I don't know if you saw, there's a fascinating thing happening now in the tundra in the Arctic. There are entirely spontaneous explosions happening.
Yeah.
Where, because the buildup of methane gas under the ice concentrates the gas, and then all of a sudden it explodes.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things aren't going to stop no matter how many mirrors you put up in the ice. And so I think that the biological processes within the Earth are already so advanced that it's very hard to see how geoengineering has a meaningful impact.
Yeah.
But we will certainly try, because something will happen. There will be some dramatic event, and we will decide the only possible response is to spend a lot of money to do something which feels satisfying. I mean, for me, so what I used to say, and you and I have shared this anecdote many times over the years, but if you woke up tomorrow morning and there was a news report that there was a meteor coming towards the Earth and it was going to hit in 10 years, and when it hit, we were all going to die, everyone would wake up tomorrow thinking about the meteor. And we'd be trying to launch nuclear weapons to move the meteor off course, or, there'd be an enormous global effort to do something. We have a meteor hitting in 10 years. We're not doing that. And so what will happen is, as the meteor gets really close and it's too late to do anything about it,
Right.
we'll do something dramatic, which will not really have the impact we want it to have. Right. And so that's where geoengineering will come in, right? I mean, we'll throw everything at the problem by the time it's too late.
Well, that's always that great quote, isn't there, from, wasn't it Churchill? The Americans. Yeah, America will always do the right thing, but only when it's exhausted every other possibility. And that's probably what we'll end up doing. Right, so let's wrap then, George. So the technology's there, so ending on a positive. The technology, we can fix this problem, but we haven't. What do I do? What does anyone listening this do today, tonight, tomorrow, this year, that will make the difference? What is required of us? I mean, I guess I'd start with the obvious one. We've got to vote for the parties that are going to drive the change. And I'm apolitical on this. I don't follow a particular brand. I vote on that basis. So apart from using our votes and actively vocalizing the fact we're supporting governments that do the right thing, what else do we do tomorrow? Because I don't want to sit and everyone listening to this just go, oh no, that sounds terrible.
Look, there are two very simple things that everybody can and should do, right? I mean, you should change your energy tariff to a renewable energy tariff, right? And that sounds silly, but it is profound. In fact, if you can change the system to renewable energy, then you have non-polluting, very available electricity, and the more of that we can get, the better. And then you shift your transportation to electric transportation, or as you and I do, bicycles or whatever. But yeah. I mean, that's a whole nother thing. But electric transportation then uses that renewable energy in an effective way. And it begins to bring down the cost of that whole system dramatically. Those are two things that everybody can do, and they're immediately available. There are all sorts of other things that you're supposed to do around your house and energy efficiency and that sort of thing, and food, and those are on food and so forth. And I eat less meat, you eat probably none now. Those three things, if you shift to renewable electricity, you go to electric transportation, and you eat less meat, you're probably doing as much as you can do, other than voting for the right thing.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good summary, actually. So Dan, I normally sum up, but what would perhaps you'd like to just reflect what you think you've heard today from George and your reflections on it?
Well, it's interesting, George. I mean, you've kind of you've echoed a lot of things that have been circling around in my head for a while, especially around the psychology of how humans approach a problem like this. I like what you're saying about the different phases over time, and
5 phases. I remember that.
Yeah, and potentially where we're going to be heading, the knee-jerk reaction that's too late, the rescue theory that's too late, and hopefully we can start pushing people another way. It does make me think here again that, we should have a real conversation about, media, PR, that kind of thing, about how to kind of get that things out there. But George, it is such a fascinating insight to hear your experience and, coming into this, the changes that you've seen, the changes that you think might happen. But it's nice to know that despite everything you've seen, that there is decent optimism.
There is some hope.
There is real hope.
And we're empowered. That's the other bit. Yeah. I'm glad George said. I mean, that it's not just a question of, wring your hands because no one's going to do anything.
Yeah.
We can. And as George has pointed out, moving the money, we spend differently in where we buy our electricity, the way we travel, what we eat and so forth. That changes markets, right? That's presumably all that we can do.
And we were making great progress in moving the investors. And they really were the best lever to pull. I think that's dissipated a little bit recently, but you talked about the CEOs. The CEOs have whatever perspective they have, but the investors ultimately are taking a longer term perspective, and they have to make money. And the only way they make money is not to be investing in things that are going to disappear. So that feels to me, from a societal perspective, still the lever to push on.
Well, that's interesting. And I guess, therefore, anyone who's got investments, it's a longer conversation, but you don't want your assets to get stranded. And for those reasons, I wouldn't be in coal for instance.
No. And I can recommend a good podcast to listen to in season 1 where a couple of guests talk about exactly that, Hugh.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed. George, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Dan, as ever, a pleasure. And I look forward to seeing you next time.
Yes. See you next time. Thanks a lot, George.
Thank you. Thanks, Sean. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Real Zero podcast with Hugh Montgomery and Daniel Grant, produced by me, Daniel Grant, aka The Stealth Doctor, on YouTube and Instagram. Find out more about Real Zero by heading to realzero.earth and find out more about how you and your friends can start making a real difference today.